David here, welcome to the channel. Today's all about fractals. When do we see systems repeat patterns over different scales? And this is chapter 8 of the book, The Science of Systems. You want to learn more about the science of systems, you can go to davidsugar.com/book. There you can download a free PDF, and you can also go to amazon.com to buy the paperback. Now, what is a fractal? Well, in a system here noted S, a fractal occurs for a given quantity X, where a mapping over scale leads to the same object X. For example, you see this triangle here with lots of little triangles inside of it. If you zoom in on one of those smaller triangles, you see the same pattern as a whole. So this is a fractal. It's a type of symmetry, but instead of rotation or reflection or translation, it's all about changes in scale. So it's a symmetrical mapping, X to X, but the mapping itself is over scale. This creates a fractal symmetry. One of the simplest ways to create a fractal is through adding different polygons. We saw before the triangular fractal that adds lots of triangles. And as you continue this can go on to infinity. Now, this is a finite version, if there's just a finite number of steps, so the scaling doesn't go all the way small and all the way large. There's a finite amount, but this could be carried out infinitely. Additionally, there can be square fractals, created with the squares as shown below. Additionally, with pentagon fractals. And these show how different polygons can be arranged in fractal orientations. You can also create fractals with 3D polyhedron. You can create a tetrahedral fractal where you stack 4 tetrahedrons and it creates a larger tetrahedron. You can create an octahedral fractal, stacking octahedrons into a larger octahedral shape, which could be continued. Similarly, with a dodecahedron, you can stack them together to a larger dodecahedral shape, and this can be continued. You can also create fractals along the perimeter of an object. One common example, this is called the Koch snowflake, and you essentially start with a triangle and you create protruding edges to make a 6-pointed star. Along each of these edges, you create new triangles to create even a more detailed star, and this process can be continued. Interestingly, if you continue this process, even though the object has a finite area, it can have an infinite boundary perimeter. So by continuing this fractal, it's possible to have an object with finite area have an infinite boundary. This snowflake perimeter can also be created 3-dimensionally. And this is a 3-dimensional Koch snowflake. It's basically doing the same pattern we saw earlier, but instead of 2 dimensions, this is now extending to 3 dimensions. So here, it's possible with a finite volume to have an infinite surface area because there's more and more sides to it. So this is a really interesting part about fractals. And actually our lungs do something similar where there's lots of little areas to increase the surface area even though there's a finite volume. Now, we're talking about different boundary perimeters even if the object has the same surface area. Well, this is related to the coastline paradox, which is that a coastline can have different boundary lengths depending on what the scale of the measurement that is used. For example, this shows a hypothetical island right here. When there's large boundary perimeters, it traces a crude shape of the island. If you're using smaller distances, a higher resolution, it creates a more detailed version. Typically, when you have smaller and smaller distances for the resolution, the boundary length increases. So this is called the coastline paradox, that the boundary length of an island, a coastline, may actually not be fixed, but it may depend on the resolution at which it is measured. One of the most helpful quantities in terms of understanding fractals is the fractal dimension. And the fractal dimension, D, is essentially what power is a given object raised to when scaling it and understanding what the measure changes by. So, for example, a line, if you scale a line by 2, the length will increase by 2. So the fractal dimension here would be 1. However, a square, two-dimensional square, if you multiply the lengths on each side by 2, increase the scaling by 2, the total area will increase by 4. So this means it's a fractal dimension of 2. Essentially, when the measure is scaled by 2, you raise that to 2, and that equals 4. A cube has a fractal dimension of 3. When you increase the object measured by 2, it increases the volume by 8, which is 2 to the third. Now, a point would have a fractal dimension of 0. It wouldn't change if you scale it by 2. Now, you see here that this fractal dimension is essentially the topological dimension. Is the line exists in 1-dimension space, the square exists in 2-dimension space, and the cube exists in 3-dimension space. So in this case, these are kind of more common geometric objects. The fractal dimension is the topological dimension in which the object resides. Now, it's also possible for the topological dimension to not equal the fractal dimension of the given object. And this is where very interesting fractals arise. So just to do a common case of when the fractal dimension D equals the topological dimension, let's look at a triangle. Now, if you scale it by 2, so there's 2 triangles along each of the edges, you see that the total area is 4. There's 4 triangles noted here in the graph, 1, 2, 3, 4, and you can see that the D, the fractal dimension, would be 2. So you scale it by 2, the area increases by 4. Just like a square, you increase it, scale it by 2, the area is 4. However, this triangular fractal, the Sierpinski fractal, when you scale it by 2, you actually see that the total area just increases by 3. Because you can see when you look inside, there's an empty space in the middle. So there's one triangle on the top, there's a second triangle on the left, the third triangle on the right. And these triangles have lots of little triangles inside of them. So this essentially means that when it's scaled by 2, the object's area only increases by 3, not by 4. So the fractal dimension D is not a whole number. It's something around 1.58 ... and this is essentially the log of 3 divided by the log of 2. So what's really interesting is that even though this Sierpinski fractal resides in a 2D topological dimension, so it resides on a plane, the fractal dimension of the object is less. It's 1.58. And often, most of the interesting fractals we consider fractals, not just of standard box, occurs when the fractal dimension D is not equal to the topological dimension in which the object resides. Fractals come commonly in biology. So when you look at tree branches, when you zoom into a tree branch, you see a very similar pattern. This picture shows zooming into tree branches. And so there's a self-similar pattern often created. Even in leaf structures, when you look at the veins and the support structures, it creates this fractal patterns where there's maybe big veins, and then you zoom in, there's medium veins, and you zoom in, there's smaller veins. And what this is creating is a very, very efficient means to transport nutrients. If it was only, let's imagine these veins are kind of like roads. If it's only really, really small roads, okay, it can get to the little details, but it's hard to travel long distances because they're just little small roads compared to like a highway. Now, if there's only highways, only big veins, well, it's hard to get to all the little spots, right? So a fractal symmetry is really providing there's some of these kind of like major highways and there's some of these smaller roads. And they basically come about as a mathematical solution to most efficiently serve a volume with a transport network. So this is why it's suspected that fractals often come about in biology as biological systems are just trying to have veins to service all the areas. The most efficient way would be to create a fractal of very small veins that coalesce to medium veins that coalesce to big veins. This allows efficient transports and sensitivity. The Romanesco broccoli is another interesting fractal. When you look at one part of the plant, it resembles the whole plant. So this is another self-similar structure that helps in its morphology. Fractals can also be seen in plants and the ratios of different biological things. And the Fibonacci sequence is another interesting type of pattern related to fractals. And we talked about earlier, the Fibonacci sequence is created by summing the two previous numbers. 1 equals 0 plus 1, 2 equals 1 plus 1, 3 equals 1 plus 2, 5 equals 2 plus 3, and so on and so forth. And you see, this is actually a self-similar pattern because it's reflected the small to the larger, then the larger to the even larger, the larger to the even larger, and so forth. So this is actually a very simple kind of fractal. And you can see oftentimes in different plant splitting patterns, you often see this fractal pattern with the Fibonacci sequence where there's 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13 different splits. Also, the population of bunnies often creates this, how they reproduce between males and females, creates this Fibonacci sequence. Even in the ratios of the bones of the fingers, they're near Fibonacci sequence. Now, these aren't perfectly matched. Not all plants have this, but a lot of plants do have these kind of Fibonacci numbers, and they show interesting self-similarity. Going further, the ratio of the Fibonacci numbers is very close to the golden ratio, here represented by the Greek letter phi. Now, this golden ratio is seen almost everywhere in the human body. There's not always there, it's often approximates, but here shows the Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man, and taking the ratio from the top of the head to the bottom feet as 1. Now, there's various golden ratios, and that basically equals the bottom of the feet to the belly button. If you take the next golden ratio, you see all these other ratios in the human body. It even extends out to the arm. So if the arm is unit 1, the ratio would be from the elbow. The golden ratio of that further would be from the hand, then the finger, and then we talked about how they're in the finger bones too, and they can be seen in the hand. So it's almost like a fractal symmetry in the morphology of human beings as well as lots of organisms. They're often based on the golden ratio. There are other scaling ratios, so this is not to say that everything follows the golden ratio, but a lot of things do follow the golden ratio. And the golden ratio can be thought of as almost the most simplest type of fractal, because if you just have a line with one dimension, the golden ratio is the point where the large to the small is the same as the whole to the large. So it's a self-similar ratio. It's the only self-similar ratio in one line segment. And this is seen in lots of biological patterns as seen in this graph below. Spirals are another interesting type of fractal, and they're self-similar. When you zoom into a spiral, it's the same pattern as above. You know, considering an infinite spiral, and you can zoom in more and more and more, and it repeats the same pattern. There's also the golden ratio pattern, where every quarter turn, the object is the golden ratio further from the center point. And the golden ratio is seen in lots of patterns, like similarly to the nautilus shell. However, there's lots of other ratios seen in spirals in nature, and these create the class of logarithmic spirals. So there's a lot of different types of spirals that can be seen. Golden ratio is just one type. And cyclones and other weather patterns often follow this kind of spiral pattern, as these different dissipative systems are, transferring energy and mass. And following the principle of least action, these spiral patterns are often created. Dendrites are another interesting type of fractal that are all about branching. So this is create a large branch with branches to medium branch, with branches to small branch with a self-similar pattern. Ice crystals is a very common dendrite, and dendrites often occur as different chemicals are changing their phases. So going from gas to liquid, from liquid to solid, like the ice, you can see these different dendrites form often. Lightning strikes are another example of dendrites, where the arcs of the lightning follow smaller branching patterns. And DLA is diffusion limited aggregation, which is basically saying, imagine all these particles are diffusing, but there's a seed particle which they can attach to. Following this pattern often creates these dendritic formations. And this could be seen in like electrodeposition, where there's gas of a given molecule and it bonds to a seed particle. And when the gas that's moving in diffusion bonds to the seed particle, it creates these DLA-like patterns. Dendrites can also be seen in different geologic patterns. So as sand has different densities, some light sand and dark sand with more iron in it have different weights, and the water as it passes prefers to move some of the sand versus others. This often creates this branching pattern. Also, if you take satellite imagery of mountain ranges with glaciers and other rivers that carve the mountains, as the water is following the principle of least action and draining to the oceans, they often create these dendritic patterns where first there's small rivers, and then they organize into medium rivers, and then into large rivers, and finally into the oceans. Also, root systems have this dendrite-like form. Again, this is creating efficient means for transporting a given volume. Dendrites are also seen in neural network cells. So coincidentally, in a neuron cell, there's a nucleus of this cell, the axon, which sends this action potential of the cell, and then that grabs on to other dendrites and other neurons to create the neural network. But from the nucleus, there's also these dendritic patterns that reach out and essentially work to accept other action potentials from other neurons. Now, these little branching patterns are also called dendrites, but this is in terms of biology in a neural cell. Now, the human brain has, billions of different neurons that create the neural network, and there's trillions of potential connections between these, all the permutations of which is allowed, and this creates a huge, vast amount of memory that can be stored. Now, fractals are suspected to occur in neural networks to support organization. So global to local organizations, kind of what we were talking about earlier, having those kind of mega highways to be efficient, but also having the small roads to get to all the details. So fractals are suspected to help neural network design, essentially create coherence between small to large scale. And there's a very crude analogy here of a fractal branching pattern where there's first one large branch, it branches to two branches similar to the dual hemispheres of the brain, and that branches into smaller and smaller patterns. Now, the brain is much more complicated than this simple fractal branching pattern, but what this is here to show is how a fractal geometry can support local to global organization. This can support sensitivity, coherence, and processing of information. There's also thoughts and studies that self-similar logic and self-similar processes may occur in neural networks to support the emergence of cognition. So fractals can play an interesting role in terms of neurons and how the brain works. So fractals have a really interesting connection to chaos. One connection can be seen in what is called the chaos game. Here, dots are placed in random inside of a triangle. The next dot, the one dot is placed in random. The following dot selects one of the three vertexes of the triangle and goes halfway to that point. At first, there seems to be no pattern in this seemingly chaotic pattern. Seen in this graph here, there's just a few dots. They seem to be everywhere. However, when you repeat this process, you select one of the three vertexes of this triangle, and you go halfway to that point. You keep on repeating that process over and over again. Eventually, you create the triangular fractal we saw earlier. Now, selecting different boundary points like square, pentagon, hexagon, you can create all these shapes here below. So these all follow this chaos game where a dot is selected at random, and then the next dot is selecting one of these boundary points, whatever it may be, a triangle, square, pentagon, and going halfway to that point. As you progress this going further and further and further, it actually creates these beautiful fractal patterns seen here. Another connection between chaos and fractals is in random walks. So in a random walk, let's imagine kind of a one-dimensional where a line is going left to right, but it can go up and down a random dimension. Now, it turns out that this random up and down over time can trace out a fractal. that there's actually self-similar patterns into various degrees of average degrees of displacement and other attributes of this random walk pattern. So when you zoom into a part, it often looks similar to the zoomed out picture. Now this can be extended to 2 dimensions and even further, where random walks in 2 dimensions also have fractal-like qualities, where certain aspects of the pattern have self-similar nature, where if you zoom in or out, it repeats. Fractals have an interesting connection to chaos theory. We explored some initial aspects of chaos theory before, but wanted to get more into chaotic attractors. Now, the notion of chaotic attractor is using something called phase space. So instead of actually tracing like the real trajectories of an object in a geometric space, for example, phase space looks at certain quantities. It might be time, it might be position, it might be other numbers, other quantities associated with the system. And what you can do is not only graph the trajectories in the actual geometric space, but you can also graph the trajectories in phase space. And using phase space to graph trajectories of systems is a really helpful way in physics to understand complex systems. Now, there are different types of attractors in chaos theory, which are basically attractions in phase space for a system to result in one given state. So a very common one is a point attractor, when lots of different initial conditions tends to settle to one point. Another type is a periodic attractor, where various initial conditions goes to a similar cyclical pattern. Now these attractors, point attractors and periodic attractors, are often fairly easy to predict out into the future. However, a strange attractor is much harder to predict. So basically, various trajectories tend to follow this strange attractor, but the attractor itself is not an easy point or periodic rotation, but is something complex. So it can't be efficiently predictable. Now, this image of a strange attractor shows a Lorentz attractor, which is essentially understanding the convection currents in like a hypothetical 2D fluid. And this could be used in various cases in physics. And this is using phase space, so it's measuring different quantities in this liquid. And what's really interesting is when you graph the trajectories of the system, it follows this strange attractor. Sometimes it's on the left side circling around, and sometimes it might flip to the right side, and it's unknown, when it will flip. It's very hard to predict. And there's actually an interesting connection to fractals here. If you look at the distribution of clumps in this strange attractor, you see it's almost like the rings of Saturn, where there's large rings, and then you go into their smaller rings, you zoom in, there's even smaller rounds. So it turns out that what seemed like a chaotic system, if you graph the trajectories in phase space, there's a hidden fractal quality to the attractor itself. So this is a really interesting type of attractor, strange attractor, that connects to chaos and also fractals. Now, and one of the most famous strange attractors is the Mandelbrot set. And this follows a condition that the next state of the system will basically equal the initial state squared plus a complex number. So this exists in the complex plane with one real number and one complex plane. Now with different values c, so different complex numbers, some of those values x will tend to diverge towards infinity, and other ones will be bounded, will either converge towards one number or will be bounded within two numbers. So the Mandelbrot set is graphing the values of x that are bound for a given complex number. And when you graph it, you see this beautiful pattern here. And when you zoom in onto the pattern repeats. And there's also other types of sets in the Mandelbrot set, like the Julia set. And it's a very beautiful fractal pattern. It contains lots of other fractal patterns. And it was one of the most common fractal patterns liked by Benoit Mandelbrot, who was one of the first people to really popularize the idea of fractals in the book, The Fractal Geometry of Nature. So power laws is a really interesting and very generalized way to understand fractals. And this is all about that fractal dimension we talked about. We often use the term D. And essentially a power law is a scale-free behavior where a given measure to outcome relates to each other through a given power. That's what they're called, power laws. So, for example, if x is length, then x squared, where we're looking about a square, for example, would be like the area. Now, x cubed would be the volume. So this is a really simple power law between length, area, and volume. And you can see on this graph, we have x squared, x cubed. Now, when you graph power laws on a logarithmic scale, so it's not just the scale doesn't go up incrementally, it goes up in powers of 10. This creates lines. So power laws create lines on logarithmic scales. Now, power laws don't care about the units or the dimensions. So the ratio between length, area, and volume doesn't care if you're thinking about centimeters or miles or, really small or really large. It would always pertain. So they cross all scales. They're scale free. Now, power laws often create distribution of objects across scale. So here shows various circles that follow a power law pattern. So basically, the count of the circle relates to the area in an inverse square relationship. So basically, when there's 4, so the count 1, the area of 1 has 1 count. The area of 1/2 has 4 counts. Area of 1/3 has 9 counts. So basically, you take the area, you inverse it, you square it, and you get the count of the number of circles. And these circles, you see, it's not just all circles the same size, right? It's going above and below, small to large. And this is creating this power law of patterns across scale. So power laws are seen very, very commonly in physics, like even gravity is inverse squared. A lot of these other things, area to volume, also like the intensity of light as it shines out, follows inverse square. And these don't care about the scale. And these are actually types of fractals, but in a very generalized sense. So power laws can also be seen in lots of unexpected places. One is in natural languages like English and other languages. When graphed, it turns out that the word's rank, how often it's used, is it the first word used, the first often, the second often. The rank of the word is very closely proportional to the inverse of the frequency of the use of the word. So let's imagine a word is the second most used word. Compared to the first, it's about used at 1/2 the time. The third most used word in a language, this might be common words like the or of, is about 1/3 the most common used word, the highest rank word. And very low rank words like chair, the frequency would be 1 over that, proportional to 1 over the rank of that word. So this is really interesting because these languages, there's lots of patterns about how to relate the words in languages, and it may not be expected that there's a power law following the word's rank to the frequency so closely, but it drops off following this kind of power law. So it's a really interesting type of power law seen. In biology, one interesting power law is seen between the metabolic rate and the mass. Basically, the mass raised to the 3/4 power. And this creates the effect that things with very, very large mass have a smaller metabolic rate than things with smaller mass. So, like a big elephant will have a much slower metabolic rate than a mice, right? So something that's smaller will tend to have a higher metabolic rate. And when you plot all the animals, their metabolic rate to mass, you may not expect to see, a relationship, but you see a pretty close power law. Now, if it's not perfect, I'll just say, there are maybe some outliers and it doesn't extend to all masses and all rates. But it's very interesting that in these complex biological systems, there's often these kind of power laws that are formed at least at some level, at some degrees of approximations are followed. Taylor's law is another power law that applies to biology. And there's a lot of different variations of Taylor laws. It can apply to a lot of different measures. But what it is looking at is the ecological variance. And the variance here is the displacement from the center. If you think about a standard deviation, that can be thought of the variance. Well, that variance is often proportional to the average, and these can represent like population density and other kind of amount of animals per land. So the density, like per land. Um, so they often have different fractal dimension D, so different powers. But it's very interesting that a lot of these ecological measures have some type of power law behind it. Now, power laws can often be seen in critical temperatures. This is looking at something called the icing model, which is basically a model of magnetic dipoles in a lattice. And these are in a square lattice, and these magnetic dipoles can either be up or down. And they're reflected by different colors, either gray or white. Now, in a low temperature state, what they find with the icing model is that groups of like charges tend to clump together in large regions. So lots of positives will be grouped together and lots of negatives will be grouped down. Now, if there's a lot of temperature, a lot of variation, we see that there's only small scale regions of like charges. There could be ups and downs everywhere. And, this could be thought about as different phases. So one phase is that the pluses and minuses of charges are more separate, and another phase are more mixed. Now, the critical temperature is just a certain temperature right in between the phases, where there turns out to be scale-free regions. So instead of just large regions or just small regions of like charges, the like charges have both large and small scales. This is similar to that circle diagram we saw earlier, where there's large circles and small circles. The circles span scale because the power laws are scale free, right? So critical temperatures often have this scale free property and follow various power laws, with a fractal dimension. So all these other chemicals and all these other molecules too, in critical states, also have scale free behaviors. So this is a really interesting connection between thermodynamics and different phases in nature and power laws and fractals. Scale-free networks are another really interesting thing. Instead of a random network where basically nodes are just connected to each other in random, a scale-free network has both large hubs and really small hubs. And this can actually be seen in the internet. And this is a picture of the internet, all the different websites and their connections. And there's a near scale-free aspect of the network. It's not perfectly scale-free. There's been some debate about, is it really truly perfectly scale-free or not? But there's many large hubs, and there's also some websites with small connections. And this is very closely resembling a scale-free network, where there's a power law associated with it, and there's a fractal symmetry, right? There's patterns between small scale and large scale that can be seen. Finally, wanted to touch a little bit on long-tailed functions. So we saw earlier with the random network versus scale-free network, a lot of random distributions tend to be centered near around an average. However, these long-tailed functions really spread that out, where you would see lots of action really far away from the average. So for example, with the network we saw earlier, with the random network, most of the networks will only have a certain amount of connections near the average. However, that scale-free network, you would see some very, very large hubs and some really small hubs too, and medium hubs. So functions across. So a lot of properties across the average. Now, power laws, they followed on a logarithmic scale, they would be lines. And on not a logarithmic scale, they would follow these kind of curves. So these long-tailed functions are not necessarily always, scale-free. These are looking at other functions that are not necessarily a perfect power law, but they do share something with the power law, which is that there are these properties that go beyond what would normally be seen around an average. And some examples of this is like earthquakes. All of a sudden there might be a huge earthquake and then not a lot of earthquakes, and a very large earthquake. And it's not just, medium-sized earthquakes seen around the average all the time. You see this huge dispersion around very large and very small. Similarly, in like stock market collapse, a stock market would collapse a lot more often than what would be expected just from a random deviation. If all the stocks were random, they would tend to kind of be averaged over time, be very close to the average. However, you see huge swings. So what's interesting about long-tail functions is that, not everything in nature follows perfect power laws or perfectly scale-free. And there's lots of scale-dependent properties in nature, like aspects of the strong force in quantum mechanics, other things determining the size of galaxies. Certain things are at certain sizes. Not everything is just perfectly scale-free. Some things happen at certain scales. So, want to make that clear here that not everything in nature is scale-free. But what's really interesting in lots of complex systems, we see these long-tailed functions that are not just centered around averages, but have this span. And so they can have large hubs of activity or huge volatility beyond the average of what would be expected. Thanks for tuning in. Today was all about fractals looking at self-similar symmetry. We saw polygons, polyhedron, we looked at biology, and we even looked at power laws, some of these deep self-similar fractals seen in nature. Thanks for tuning in and stay tuned for the next episode. If you want to get the PDF for free, go to davidsugar.com/book. There you can download the book, and Amazon has a paperback. Thanks for tuning in.